A 2017 report by the EPA Inspector General found that the agency's oversight of state solid waste programs was insufficient to ensure compliance with federal minimum criteria. The EPA had not conducted oversight reviews of many state programs in years, in some cases, decades. State programs were operating without the level of EPA scrutiny that RCRA contemplated. And in several states, inspection rates at regulated facilities have fallen to levels that made meaningful enforcement essentially impossible. Welcome back to Threat Level Red. I'm Charles Denyer. This is part 4 of Buried Beneath Us, our investigation into the American landfill crisis, the system that created it, and the political machinery that keeps it in place. In part 3, we looked at the throwaway economy, the deliberate design of disposability, the Keep America Beautiful campaign that transferred moral responsibility from manufacturers to consumers, and the lobbying record that has kept the United States from adopting the producer responsibility policies that most of the developed world now treats as standard practice. Today, we're going inside the regulatory system, because the story of how America got to 2,000 active landfills and 10,000 closed ones, and why the communities living next to them have so little recourse, is also a story about what happens to a regulatory agency when the industry it regulates is wealthier, better organized, and more politically sophisticated than the agency itself. It is a story about regulatory capture, the slow, systematic process by which the regulator comes to serve the interests of the regulated, yet never making a single overtly corrupt decision.
Welcome to Threat Level Red, a Charles Denyer Productions podcast. Every week, Charles brings his real-world expertise to the front lines of America's most pressing threats: cyber attacks, extremist networks, rogue states, terrorism, economic instability, systemic breakdowns, and so much more. From the digital battleground to the streets of America, no threat is left uncovered. No spin, no filters, just intel.
The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, more commonly known as RCRA, was the foundational federal statute for solid waste management in the United States. Passed during the same wave of environmental legislation that produced the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, RCRA was ambitious in its stated purpose: to establish a comprehensive national framework for managing solid and hazardous waste from cradle to grave that would protect public health and the environment. The congressional record around RCRA's passage is full of exactly the kind of language you would hope to find: detailed attention to environmental justice, recognition of the need to move toward waste reduction and recycling, along with an acknowledgement that the existing system of unregulated disposal was causing serious harm. The distance between that legislative intent and the regulatory reality that followed is one of the more disheartening stories in the history of American environmental policy. RCRA delegated most of its implementation authority to the states, subject to EPA oversight. The practical effect of this delegation was to create 50 separate regulatory regimes with 50 separate levels of political will, administrative capacity, and resistance to industry influence. States that competed aggressively for industrial development, and many of the states with the most landfills fall into this category. They had structural incentives to interpret RCRA requirements in ways that imposed the least burden on the waste industry. The EPA's oversight of state programs has been, by the agency's own periodic admissions, woefully inadequate. The 1991 Subtitle D regulation that established minimum technical standards for municipal solid waste landfills, such as linear requirements, leachate collection, groundwater monitoring, closure, and post-closure care standards, represented a genuine step forward from the pre-regulatory era. But they contained a significant limitation that the industry had lobbied hard to preserve. They applied only to landfills operating after 1993 or to existing landfills that would remain open for several more years. The enormous legacy inventory of pre-1993 landfills, including most of the 10,000 closed facilities, were largely grandfathered out of the new requirements. The technical standards that might have prevented groundwater contamination at older facilities came too late to do so. So the EPA maintains a database of solid waste facilities, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act information system known as RCRA Info, and that it tracks compliance status, inspection records, and violation histories at regulated facilities. Analysis of that very database by journalists, researchers, and the agency's own Inspector General has repeatedly documented the same basic pattern. Number one, any number of regulated landfills have pending or unaddressed violations at any given time. Number two, inspection frequencies fall well below the rates that would be needed for meaningful oversight. And number three, the civil penalties imposed when violations are documented are routinely too small to represent a meaningful deterrent to an industry generating billions in annual revenue. A 2017 report by the EPA Inspector General found that the agency's oversight of state solid waste programs was insufficient to ensure compliance with federal minimum criteria. The report documented that the EPA had not conducted oversight reviews of many state programs in years. In some cases, decades. State programs were operating without the level of EPA scrutiny that RCRA contemplated, and in several states, inspection rates at regulated facilities had fallen to levels that made meaningful enforcement essentially impossible. The funding picture explains much of this. The EPA's budget has been a recurring target of congressional hostility since the Reagan administration, and the solid waste program has not been exempt. Adjusted for inflation, the EPA's operating budget in recent years has been below its 1980 level. The agency employs fewer enforcement personnel today than it did in the 1990s. State environmental agencies, which conduct the vast majority of day-to-day landfill oversight, face similar or worse resource constraints, compounded by ever-mounting state budget pressures and concentrated industry opposition. And then you have the revolving door between the waste industry and its regulators, which is not unique to waste management. It is a feature of regulatory politics across the American economy. But in the waste sector, it operates with particular efficiency because the regulatory agencies and the regulated companies are in close and continuous contact over permit applications, compliance determinations, rulemaking proceedings, and enforcement negotiations. And because the technical expertise needed to evaluate the industry's practices is concentrated in a relatively small community of professionals who move between government service and private practice throughout their careers. Former EPA officials, including former division directors, program managers, and regional administrators, routinely move to positions as consultants, lobbyists, or employees for waste management companies or the law firms and consulting firms that represent them. And the flow moves in both directions. Industry consultants and lawyers take positions in the EPA's solid waste programs, bringing with them relationships and perspectives formed during years of representing the industry they will now regulate. This is not a conspiracy, to be clear. It is a structural feature of the regulatory environment that consistently shapes how regulations are written, how enforcement priorities are set, and where the boundaries of permissible conduct are drawn. The effect on rulemaking is documented and measurable. Academic research on regulatory capture consistently finds that industries subject to this kind of revolving door dynamic receive much more favorable regulatory treatment, such as weaker standards, longer compliance timelines, and lower penalties than the public interest calculus alone would produce. In the solid waste sector, this has manifested in rulemaking timelines that consistently favor industry convenience over public health urgency, in compliance deadlines that stretch for years or decades, and in penalty structures that treat violations as a cost of doing business rather than as a deterrent. The contrast with other regulatory environments is instructive. The European Union's Landfill Directive, adopted in 1999 and progressively tightened since, imposes standards on landfill siting, construction, operation, and post-closure monitoring that are substantially more stricter than their American equivalents. It prohibits the landfilling of liquid waste and certain hazardous materials. It sets binding targets for the diversion of biodegradable waste from landfills, targets that have driven investment in composting and anaerobic digestion infrastructure. And it requires financial guarantees that ensure companies can fund post-closure care and remediation without relying on the goodwill of regulators or the outcome of future litigation. The EU's landfilling rates for municipal solid waste have fallen dramatically over the past 2 decades, from over 60% in 2000 to under 25% today, while American landfilling rates have remained largely stable. The American regulatory framework could be strengthened in ways that would produce comparable results. Extended post-closure care requirements beyond 30 years would be a good start. Furthermore, mandatory PFAS monitoring in landfill leachate and binding treatment standards for PFAS-contaminated leachate are urgently needed given what we now know about PFAS in the waste stream. And what about financial assurance requirements? The mechanisms that are supposed to ensure companies can fund cleanup without taxpayer bailouts. They need substantial strengthening, as current requirements are widely recognized as inadequate to the actual liability they are supposed to cover. And the chronic underfunding of EPA's solid waste programs needs to be addressed if the agency is to be capable of meaningful oversight. None of these changes are technically difficult. All of them are politically difficult, because all of them would reduce the profitability of the waste management industry and increase the cost of disposable packaging and consumer goods. The industry knows this. It funds the lobbying and the campaign contributions and the think tank research that ensures these conversations remain at the margin of policy debate rather than at the center. That's where we end Part 4. In Part 5, the final episode, we're going to talk about what comes next, what a post-landfill America might look like, what policy tools actually exist to get there, and what it would take politically to deploy them at the scale that the problem demands. Stay with us.
Threat Level Red is a Charles Denyer Productions podcast. For more information, visit charlesdenyer.com to learn more about current and upcoming podcasts and episodes, current and future book publications, professional services offered by Charles, and much more. All opinions expressed are those of the host and do not reflect the official positions of any government agency, military branch, or national security organization.